Good evening. I'm Deborah Zarin. I'm talking to you about the role and importance of clinical trial registries and results database. I'm the director of ClinicalTrials.gov, and we will go through some of the basics. Most of the material is in the actual book chapter, so I think I'm going to try to focus on a few of the more interesting points and leave some of the details to your reading. So this is the outline of what I'll be covering tonight. So the real question is, why is disclosure important? Why do we exist at all? And for that, it's helpful to think about evidence-based medicine. And the concept of evidence-based medicine is that clinical and policy decisions should be informed by evidence regarding the benefits, risks, and other burdens associated with all possible alternatives. Clinical trials are a key component of the body of scientific evidence that must be used to make decisions, and most decision makers depend on summary data from journal articles. But then what's all the fuss about? Well, the suppression of research results impedes the scientific process, and the suppression of clinical trial data compared to other research data is particularly problematic, and that's because trials depend on human volunteers who put themselves at risk, and the trial results inform our medical decisions. So there are three key problems with the evidence base. Not all trials are published. When published, the publications don't always include all of the pre-specified outcome measures. And sometimes unacknowledged changes are made to the trial protocol that would affect the interpretation of the findings. Here's a sort of infamous example. There were a few scandals that kind of instigated the current phase, the modern phase, if you will, of trial reporting. And this was a study of celecoxib, otherwise known as Celebrex, compared to other NSAIDs. And it was the study was looking at the propensity to cause ulcers. So the vertical axis is the cumulative percentage of participants who had an ulcer complication. And you could see here that the red line for celecoxib makes it appear as if celecoxib was less likely to cause ulcers than the comparator drugs. And in fact, these results were statistically significant, and this was published originally in JAMA, showing that celecoxib was the better drug in terms of ulcer complications. However, it later became apparent that the study was a 12-month study, not a 6-month study. And you could see that at 12 months, celecoxib looks no better than the two comparators. And in fact, it was pre-specified in the protocol as a 12-month study. So the pre-specified primary outcome measure was the probability of ulcer complication at 12 months, not at 6 months. The problem is when they published the 6-month data, they already had the 12-month data, but the journal editors and the peer reviewers of JAMA didn't know that these data were available. So you can imagine researchers sitting around looking at the data for 12 months and saying, the results don't look very good for our drug. What should we do? And then they noticed that the 6-month data looked good, and they published that. And this was one of the sort of tipping point scandals that got the journal editors and others to demand trial registration in which the pre-specified outcome measures would be made public. And in fact, later, as part of a lawsuit, an internal corporate email came out that said they swallowed our story hook, line, and sinker. And by they, I take that to mean all of us, the entire medical community, because it wasn't just the editor and peer reviewers at JAMA, it was actually all of the physicians who prescribed celecoxib, and basically they pulled one over on us. So when you think of levels of transparency, if you will, it goes all the way from the left side of this diagram to public knowledge that the trial exists, all the way to the right side, which is now under discussion, access to the full data set. So ClinicalTrials.gov, we talk about the blue parts, which is trial existence and the summary of the protocol details, and the orange part, if you will, the summary of results. So you can think about the trial reporting system as the combination of the systems like ClinicalTrials.gov and the policies that either require or incentivize the use of that system. So you think about prospective trial registration, so saying ahead of time that you're going to do this study and what the protocol requires you to do. Summary results reporting, which is the aggregate data that was pre-specified in your protocol. And then finally, individual participant data, or otherwise known these days as data sharing. So these are the definitions that I just gave you. So at this time, ClinicalTrials.gov has now it has over 210 registered studies. These include both interventional studies, otherwise known as clinical trials, and observational studies. We get about 500 new trials registered per week. Overall, the WHO runs a search portal for several clinical trial registries that has about 300,000 studies in it. And the total actual number of trials in the US and worldwide are not known because there are still a number of trials that are not registered anywhere. For summary results reporting, ClinicalTrials.gov now has the results for over 20,000 registered studies. And there's a law that requires reporting of results, and I'll get into that in a minute. This is just to point out that there are stages in the disclosure that parallel the research life cycle. So if you think about the research study on the left, starting with IRB review and approval of the protocol, all the way through to study completion and data analysis, you could see that you have to keep up your ClinicalTrials.gov record, if you will, at all stages, both starting with initial registration to updating the registry as needed, finally summary results reporting, and then any updates to the results database as necessary. So again, thinking about the purpose of ClinicalTrials.gov and other trial reporting systems, you need to think about the 4 categories of human subject protections, research integrity, evidence-based medicine, and allocation of resources. So current policies, which I will mostly leave the details to your reading, but there are 2 important policies. One is the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, or ICMJE, which requires the registration of all interventional studies or clinical trials prior to enrollment of the first participant. And you need to do that in order to have your study eligible for publication in one of the journals. And then in the US, there's a law called FDA, or the FDA Amendments Act, which requires both registration and summary results reporting for certain trials of drugs and devices. So in addition, you can see on this slide, there's 3 columns, one for the ICMJE policy all the way on the right, one for FDA, which is over on the left, and then the middle policy is there's a draft NIH policy, which is expected to be finalized later this year, which also requires registration and results reporting for all clinical trials funded by the NIH, funded in whole or in part by NIH. So that's a broad policy which would require registration and results reporting, regardless of whether the study involves a drug or device. And you risk loss of NIH funding for you and your institution for lack of compliance with that policy. And here's a New England Journal article describing those policies. So at this time, we're expecting finalization of the rules for FDA and the NIH policy in about early fall, late summer, early fall of this coming year. So let's go to this. And the other point is that at this time, well, I can go back here, many people are writing articles talking about compliance with these policies. And in particular, here's a sample of 3 studies showing compliance with the policies. And you could see that this was a Stat News article that was focusing on academic medical centers. So a lot of previous attention was focused on industry, drug and device companies, and their relative lack of compliance. But recently, attention has been focused on recipients of NIH and other funders who fund research at academic medical centers, and that there basically is a spotlight being shined on failure to report. And here's another article looking at failure to report among academic medical centers. And this is getting a lot of attention in the US. Just to note that there are other policies besides the ones that I've mentioned. And